Thanks, Craig. Is that all right? You won't be seeing any wedding pictures of us from 30-some years ago. Well, this is a special week for Robyn and I. I want to start with Norm's message of this week. It's an emotional week, as you've heard, for him and his family, as he shared God's truth about the loss of a spouse, the loss of a mother, the loss of a friend, and a woman of faith. And the things that have struck me from the discussion that we've had thus far is to look back and see the ways the Lord has brought you on this journey. Will we allow our limited experiences to tell us about God's love and who He is? And God will use past adversity to prepare us for the future. And finally, He tests us to know what is in our heart. The Scripture says for God to, but it's what is in our heart, to reveal it to us. So for 5 weeks in a row, and Tom and I have talked about this, the speakers directly spoke to me as I'm getting prepared for these messages, and Tom and I commented on this last week. And as I shared with Norm today, I said, perhaps this week it's even more extraordinary than the prior 4 weeks. So I continue to marvel at how the Holy Spirit works in this place as we seek Him. So I want to start by sharing something. Now, most of you, that many of you know us, obviously, and some don't, you'd say we had this meet and greet session on Sunday. So you might think the normal greet would be, hello, Todd, hello, Robyn, whatever. I will tell you, truthfully, that was not how I was greeted on Sunday at the ice cream. It was Moses. Thank you. Yes, because for the last 20 or so years, I've been part of the drama team at Zionsville Fellowship, and I was Moses every 5 years. So all the little kids that grew up, they would call me Moses. They never called me Todd. So again, in God's providence, what is Norm speaking about this week? He's speaking about Moses in Deuteronomy 8. It's also, and my wife can attest to this, if there's one biblical story I have shared more than any other, it's the story of the Exodus journey. Because for me, a logical person, they're in bondage 430 years. You get out and you get 40 more years of wandering in the wilderness. Why would the Lord do that? Again, Norm is sharing with us this week of why God did that. So I want to start, and as Craig said, about this glorious unfolding. There really is no logical reason we're here. I did not grow up camping. We lived in Indianapolis for 32 years. Our youngest son, Chase, lived there until last week. He moved to Cincinnati. Robyn's sister lived in Indianapolis as well. She grew up there. We have many deep friendships and have been involved in the community for a long time. The last 10 years I worked at the NCAA, supervised a group of about 100 people. There really was no logical reason to be here. But what I've come to know about myself is, besides my faith, family, and friends, there are 3 things that are really important to me that I share alongside with Carrie Moss. Zionsville Fellowship, Fort Wilderness, and Covenant Christian High School back in Indianapolis. So now there's an opportunity where the convergence of both Zionsville Fellowship and Fort Wilderness come to play this week. And so that's why I want to share our story. So we're going to do it a little different than we've done in weeks past, because some of you know the story a little, some of it you know it a fair amount, and some of it you don't know it at all. And I'm also going to ask a few of you to participate in the middle of the evening. If I share a particular story of which you're involved, stand up briefly. Because partly why I want you to stand up is just to share the testament that God is about how He works in the midst of all these things. So if you would bear with me on that. But I also would say that we are very happy to be here, but we just never would have dreamed of a scenario that we would be up here. We love it here. So I'm going to start with an invitation. It started a little over 20 years ago. We were invited to camp. For most of you, you are familiar with the Agoric family. He is a neighbor of ours. He's a longtime friend. He's a recent board member. He's a member of Zionsville Fellowship, and he was the speaker at Family Camp 3. And if you know Keith, he likes to be engaged. And so our son, Peyton, at the time, was having a discussion with his daughter, Rachel. They tended to hang out together, and there was a discussion outside, and Keith and his family had just come to Fort Wilderness for the first time. And so they're talking to Peyton about it and talking about camping, and Peyton said, "We don't do camping, my dad's a businessman." So Keith, being the type of guy he is, said, "I've got to invite those people to Fort Wilderness." So in 1997, we came to Fort Wilderness. And I checked with our business office today because I like numbers and I like how things are ordered and all that sort of stuff. So we arrived at Fort Wilderness 20 years ago tomorrow, July 20th. And we arrived at the Klondikes, which Tom said had an aroma. So here's the first part. The three families that were there were the Applegates, the Duffys, and the Lydens. So you can stand up, Applegates and Duffys. Now, by my count, there were 40 Zionsville families. At that time, I think, Tom, it was a Zionsville week, I believe. But there were 40 families, and there were 10 families from Zionsville that are still going to camp today that are here this year, so 25%. So if you're here that week, you can stand up as well. The Morelands were part of it, so stand up, Mark. And when we got done at the end of this first week of camp, Keith asked me, "So what'd you think about Fort Wilderness?" And Robin's response, "I loved Ron's announcements." I thought, you got to be kidding me. We travel 520 miles to hear some old dude share announcements for the week? But we kept coming back. We came back in 1998, 99, and 2000. It was a great experience and a reservoir of memories. And then the summer of 2000, and again, I'm sharing a few more details this week because they're important to me because you are all family. And Fort is a family. But in 2000, Peyton got to participate in the praise worship band. And he would say later that that was one of the 5 best memories of his life, was participating in the praise worship band. So one of the members of that band is here, Dion Wycliffe. Where are you, Dion? You can stand up as well. And I love God's providence because the Wycliffes have not been back here to a family camp in 15 or 17 years, but for whatever reason, the Lord brought them back this week. And I remember a conversation, and some of you might think, well, these are all your intimate friends. No, these are not all intimate friends, some of which we have barely some level of relationship with. But Dion shared with me, he goes, he didn't understand how impactful it was for a young boy like Peyton at 13 to participate in that praise worship band and what the impact and influence that was on his life at that time. So in the summer of 2000, another very memorable thing happens. You're probably getting a theme that I pay attention to teaching while I'm here. But Eric Bobbitt, where are you, Eric? He's in the back, so you might have to stand up a few seconds longer. But anyways, Eric taught that week. And it was from the passage 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7. "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while. If need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, that being more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise and honor and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ." And then after Eric shared these series of messages, much like what Norm has shared this week, there was a man in our body, Greg Kavanaugh, that had one of the more bizarre and interesting prayers I've ever heard. And those in Zionsville know Greg. He's a man that's battled a series of illnesses and health problems over his life. But he was praying fervently with the Lord, "Lord, if I need to suffer, let me suffer, but I don't want to suffer. You know I don't want to suffer. And if I need to suffer," I'm thinking, what kind of person prays this prayer? I was 37 years old at the time. We'd never really had any suffering of any consequence in our life. But Lord was just preparing us for what was going to lie ahead. Later that year, Peyton became sick. We thought he had the flu. It was December 21st. And on December 31st, there was a lesson at Sunday school at Zionsville Fellowship. Joey Stein, are you here? He's not. Donna, you can stand up. Joey taught the Sunday school with Pam Bash. The lesson that December 31st was on invincibility, that no one is invincible. The next day, Peyton would be admitted to the hospital, Riley Children's Hospital. He was 6'1", 175 pounds. He was diagnosed with sepsis, which he had contracted an infection that somehow made its way to his heart. He had multiple organ failure, and he was very, very sick. As one doctor said, he was the sickest kid in Riley Children's Hospital, which is not what you want in an acute care facility. There was a woman that was his attending physician at the time, Ndidi Musa, and she asked us a question. She said, you can choose what man, medicine, and machines can do, or you can choose what God can do. I don't know. Was this the test that Norm was talking about? Are we going to choose right? Are we going to put our faith in man, or are we going to trust in what God could do? And so we said, we'll trust in what God can do. And that started an incredible journey of 33 days. But in the Lord's providence, one of the things that is a blessing of being part of Zionsville Fellowship is that when you join Zionsville Fellowship, which we had done just 4 months earlier, because we had come to family camp for 4 years, not as part of Zionsville Fellowship, but just because a neighbor invited us. But once we joined in that September, Peyton was assigned a prayer partner. You're assigned a prayer partner if you're in junior high or high school. And his prayer partner was somebody that he had played in the praise worship the prior summer, Scott Cooper. So where's Julie? So Scott Cooper, his prayer partner, worked at Indiana University Health. His room looked directly across the courtyard into Peyton's hospital room. So the Lord had providentially arranged that the prayer partner was going to be there for Peyton when he needed him. So our daily prayer was quite simple. We wanted first God to be glorified. Secondarily, we wanted for the doctors and nurses to know what to do, to have wisdom and discernment. And thirdly, we wanted healing. And that was our prayer in that order. And we did not want a phone call in the middle of the night. And so for 33 days, we went through that. The last week, January 29th, was a difficult week. And on January 29th, it was a Monday, I got a phone call from Robyn about 6:30 in the evening. And Peyton was crashing. This was the first time he was literally crashing. They thought he might pass. And his condition was such that he was intubated, medically induced coma. He was on round-the-clock dialysis. He was a sick kid. And so Robyn called and said, you need to get to the hospital. So I rushed to the hospital. I contend to be a little bit of an aggressive driver. I'm getting ready to get on the interstate, and it's a yellow light, and darn it, the car right in front of me stops, as there could have gotten the interstate, so I'm mad. And then I look at the car in front of me, and I see their license plate, and it said PSLAM 23. So the Lord is now speaking to me that in this darkest moment, I'm to trust in the Lord as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I thought, how good are you, God, that you can comfort me at this time? On Wednesday of that week, we received, again, he was having significant difficulties, and there were 3 different people that all shared the same scripture from Psalm 118:8. It is better to trust in the Lord than to have confidence in man. I thought, wow, this is really good. And as Norm shared from Psalm 73:28, but it's good now for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord God, that I may declare all your words. And we knew this was the case because this was also at the advent of the World Wide Web and the internet. And so we were sharing a lot about Peyton's situation. These prayer requests were going out not only throughout the state of Indiana, but across the country. February 2nd, we got that dreaded phone call during the night that Peyton was crashing. It was 3:30 in the morning. We called friends. We rushed to the hospital. And Robyn was groaning, just as it says in Romans. She was groaning. She was groaning that his life would have meaning. For 33 days, we had not taken our youngest son, Chase, to the hospital. He was 7 at the time. You don't want a 7-year-old to see somebody that is that sick, and we were fearful that it might scar him. But we had decided the prior day that we would take Chase to the hospital. So Chase went to the hospital with his brother Blake, his older brother Blake, and Peyton's girlfriend. And so they visited him at 2:30 that afternoon, and then they left. So again, Peyton had miraculously rebounded. And Ndidi Musa's doctor for a long time couldn't figure out, why does he keep rebounding? And I'll get that answer in a little bit. So they left the hospital at 3:30, and at 3:45, there was friends that showed up. We had a lot of friends that came to comfort us during this time. So Sherry Miller is back there. You can stand up. So we had to tell Sherry, hey, we're getting a call from the doctor. Can we see you later? Because the doctor came to us right when Sherry was there. And so we huddled in the room next to Peyton's room with Dr. Safarian Dr. Musa and Keith Agoric. You can see the picture of Dr. Musa and her husband there on the slide. And so Dr. Safarian, he said, I know of your faith, but there's nothing more we can do. He's on 100% oxygen support. You're going to have to make a decision at some point in time. I don't know when, but it's inevitable. And Keith quoted from John 10. He said, the sheep will hear my voice. And then indeed he said, God will declare himself. And I said, I don't think it's fair that any man or father should have to make a decision about their son's life. I said, I don't care if it's 2 days, 2 hours, 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 minutes. God will declare himself. And so right after I said that, we heard a series of rapid beeps in the next room. Beep, 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 beep. Exactly like that. And Robyn, I guess just like Norm shared earlier about Katie and a sense of humor, she said, maybe God is speaking right now. Dr. Safarian is kind of white as a ghost. He went over to the next room. Peyton's oxygen, which had been hovering at borderline acceptability of 85 to 88%, immediately plummeted to 50%, and he passed away. I thought, how good is our God that Peyton was in the hospital almost 3 million seconds. And all it took was to ask the Lord of this universe, you make the decision. That's not our decision to make. So we arrived home that night. My boys had gone to a thing at their school, a carnival. And so one of the things is now, how do you tell your kids that your older brother has passed away? Particularly our middle child, Blake, who was so optimistic every day trying to figure out what if they tried this, what if they tried that? So we've got to tell Blake, the eternal optimist, his brother's passed away. My brother Scott, you can stand up, was with them. And so he brought them back from the carnival. And then, again, in a poignant moment of God's comfort, Blake said, hey, Uncle Scott, his favorite uncle, by the way, I want to take you up to Peyton's room. I want to show you all the stuff you got, the Peyton Manning jersey and the stuff from Indiana University and the Pacers and all the various people that were just sending all this stuff. So they go up to Peyton's room. But then they immediately came back downstairs. I thought, this is odd. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to see. And they both come down there kind of almost white as a ghost. They both had heard the perfect strum of a guitar in his room and turned around and walked back downstairs. Was this the Lord trying to provide comfort supernaturally that everything is okay? What I love about it is we have witnesses, just like in the Gospels. There are witnesses that can attest to all of these things. That evening, Keith Agoric called Fort Wilderness because we have a long-standing relationship with Fort Wilderness. And so he wanted to talk about the passing, and he called and spoke to Gene Robertson. So Gene, stand up. Told Gene, hey, Peyton has passed away. And they got to discussing about a memorial. And Gene said, hey, we've always wanted a medical facility. And so the Agorics and Gene talked about this, and the decision was to have a medical facility. Fort was in the middle of a capital campaign at the time, so they already had renderings in place, and providentially, the next morning was a regularly scheduled quarterly board meeting. The board approved the plans for Peyton's place to be built that next morning. And we raised about $80,000 in a few weeks. And there was one particular gift that did not make a lot of sense to us, and I'll share that in a minute. So we came up in September of 2001, built the shell of Peyton's place with a number of folks from the body of Zionsville Fellowship and others. And then that following, and every year the Zionsville Fellowship has a winter youth retreat. So if you've ever participated in a winter youth retreat with Zionsville Fellowship, stand up. That place has blessed a lot of people. There have been a lot of pictures that have taken place in front of Peyton's place. The following year, July 14th, 2002, I think it's on the stone out in front, there was going to be a dedication. It was during the family camp week. And so Robyn and I were walking from the beach about 2:30 in the afternoon towards the moonbeam. And so we got up the road, and we were literally standing right in front of Peyton's place an hour before the dedication. And I don't know what to describe it as, but we heard a shriek come from behind us. And it was from Mary Wirtz. Mary, if you can stand up. Mary and Ron, they would always stay in that campsite. I don't know what it is, 18 or 19, right at the corner. It is literally the only campsite that looks immediately upon Peyton's place. They had stayed there for years. And she was going into anaphylactic shock. So Robyn rushes over. She's a nurse, ministers the EpiPen, and then soon unfolds a scene that I've not seen often at Fort. Steve Seifert, which is in the back, you can wave, shows up to help Robyn, and they're tending to Mary. And then in a little bit, the emergency vehicles show up, and then comes into camp, and there's the sirens whirling, and it's like, wow, this is something. And who shows up but Mark Fetzer? Mark, where are you? Now, what's really interesting about Mark Fetzer is Mark was the guy that in 1999 or 98, I think it was 99, that when we went on a Grand Canyon trip with Peyton and I, this non-camping guy, Mark was our lead guy. And so he had been on staff at that time. So I'm seeing this all unfold. Mary Wirtz, who's in our Growing Kids God's Way, going into anaphylactic shock, the dedications in an hour, the emergency vehicles. I think, Lord, what are you doing? I mean, this is like a movie that's unfolding in my eyes. But what I also knew, and Robyn and I had talked about during the midst of the fundraising efforts, there was one gift that was made to the building of Peyton's place that Robyn and I could never figure out. In our view, it was extravagantly generous, and we couldn't figure out why they made such a gift. And it was from Ron and Mary Wirtz. And now on this day, this is unfolding. I thought, God, how good are you? You have ordered all these things. So I'm starting to see the picture of what has taken place. I want to fast forward a few years and talk about when Rob and I started to sense a calling to ministry. It was providential today, too. Norm was talking about hiking. And Rob and I, about 4 or 5 years ago, started sensing in our season of life a call to ministry through hiking creation, one's journey and story. We felt that, just like Fort Wilderness, there was an opportunity to impact people for the gospel. If you could get them outside, you could get them alone, get them on a hiking trail, maybe not in the misery that Norm described earlier this morning, but somehow connect with them and to do this. And so we started talking about this. And then in May 2013, our son Blake graduated from college, so he said, we've gone to Fort Wilderness all these years, we've gone on soccer trips, can we just do one normal vacation? And we went out to Glacier National Park in Montana. Now, there's a side note that I'll share if anybody wants to be humored. Robyn, there's a version of one of our hikes, would come close to paralleling the story that Norm shared this morning. I think the rangers said when we got on this particular trail, I thought you guys were locals because we were trudging through snow that she would get buried in up to her waist. And so you can ask her about that sometime. I did have a sense she could divorce me on that trip. And that is a true story. But there was a bigger story to that trip at Glacier National Park. We were hiking, and the first day we stumbled across a young lady that was hiking by herself, and I said to Robyn, I wonder what her story is. And the reason is the rangers had said, you've got to be careful, there's bears that are waking up, this is, early in the season, it's right before Memorial Day, and I couldn't figure this out. So, for those that know anything about Glacier, it's 1 million acres, 750 miles of trails. We ran into her the next day on a different trail. And then 2 days later, we ran into her 2 hours from where we first met. And I thought, why do we keep running into this young lady? I mean, this is a massive place. So we took pictures, exchanged information, and that was it. About 18 months later, I was traveling on business in South Carolina. And Rob and I, again, were talking about this hiking ministry at dinner. And we left dinner, and we're driving to our hotel, which is an hour and a half away, and I said to her, Rob, you remember that young lady that we met hiking last year in Glacier? She lives in South Carolina. And Robyn said, yeah, kind of, whatever. That's pretty much how she said it. She was not, so I love her though, please. But anyways, the next morning I woke up, and the Holy Spirit was working on me not since the time that Peyton was sick. It's like, I've got to find this person. Why would I run into somebody 3 times in Glacier National Park? And they live in South Carolina. How often do you get down there? So anyways, I did something I've only done once in my life. Google a name, up pops a bunch of search websites, and Robyn had given me her permission, although she said that's kind of creepy, it's her words. So I Google the name, and up comes 24 names with her name. And then I forgot to say that prior night, we were driving back to our hotel, I saw an exit, and I said, I think that's where she lives. And the reason is I didn't have her contact information. It was in my phone from a year and a half ago. I didn't have her information, so all I had was my memory of what I thought her name was and where she lived. But nonetheless, I got these names. I went down the bottom list, and her name was there where I thought she lived. And so I called the number. It was disconnected, and I prayed, Lord, if you want me to find this person, you'll make it happen. And I called the second number, and her mother answered, and I said, is Shannon there? And she said, yeah, that's my daughter. And I said, did she happen to hike at Glacier National Park last year? And she said, yeah, she did. I said, well, this is kind of strange, but we were hiking there, and we ran into her 3 times, and we're in South Carolina, and we just want to connect. And so she gave me her number at her work, and I said, trust me, we're not creepers or stalking her. Yeah, that's what I said. And this is a little odd story. Some wonder where I'm going with this, but I will get there. But anyways, so I called up her work. Now I'm traveling all through South Carolina, Charleston and Myrtle Beach and Columbia and near Charlotte. Where she worked was literally 2 miles from where I was going to be going that day for a meeting. And this was an hour and a half away. So this was like 2 hours away. And so I left a message. She called me back, and I said, hey, you remember us? And yeah. I said, well, we're in South Carolina. Would you want to get together? And she said, yeah, I'm glad to. I said, well, how about tonight after I get done with meetings? And she said, I've got a commitment, but I could meet for lunch. So we decided to go out and we'd meet for lunch, which was fine, had a delightful lunch. She was hiker, runner, nice person. She thought we were her guardian angels. Left the meeting and said, we'll be in touch. Later that day, I picked up Robyn. I had to drop her off for 3 hours while I had a meeting since she wasn't planning to go up there. So I dropped her off, and I said, Robyn, let's just grab dinner because it's too far to drive back to the hotel. So we looked for this place, this pizza place, couldn't find it. Drove across the street to Target, got a bunch of stuff, drove back to I said, can we try to find this pizza place again? I knew I saw it. And we found it, go into the pizza place, go up to the hostess stand, walk in, and she's sitting in the first booth there on the right. This is now the 5th time we've run into this woman without any, I'm thinking, Lord, why? Why are we seeing this person? We agreed that we would meet 3 months later to, for the first time, have a planned meeting when we went down to Charlotte, and I took Robyn with me. About 3/4 of the way through dinner, she shared her story with us, and it was incredibly sad. It was very emotional, and Robyn said, this is the type of stuff I read about in books or see in movies. And I got very emotional. I said, now I know why the Lord put us together. I didn't know if it was to confirm that we really are supposed to be in the ministry of hiking and one's journey, calling, and story. I didn't know if it was to be of encouragement to her as she has subsequently come to our house at Christmas and we've gone on hikes together. She's coming up to Fort this fall. Or I didn't know if it was that her story would get published someday. It was earlier this year. We wrote the foreword to it. And Keith Agoric, the person that introduced us to camp, he's the president of the largest publishing company in America, and he published this story. So was it just because God wanted us to care about one indiscriminate stranger? I don't know what all of his unfolding is as he puts these things before us. But it was a signal to us that, again, we can trust in the Lord, that he does have plans beyond what we can possibly see. So it was later than that coming year that the story of Fort Wilderness really unfolded in its total. I went to a breakfast meeting with a friend of ours, so I'll publicly acknowledge him here with the Zionsville Fellowship family, Jeff Terp. And Jeff likes to, if I can say this word, pimp people. And so that's true for those that know Jeff. So Jeff, at the end of breakfast, says, Todd, you need to apply for the Fort Wilderness job. Jeff, what are you talking about? He goes, well, I know about your desire to be in ministry, hiking, and all that sort of stuff. And, Fort Wilderness has plenty of people that can do camp. They need somebody that can lead camp. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. I mean, I'd prayed for this person, but I had never thought that this would be me. So I went back to my office a little bit rattled. I called Robyn on the way home, or the way back to the office. She goes, well, that's interesting. And so I'm on my way back to the office of the NCA. I walk into a meeting with my number 2 person there for first meeting, sit down with Gary DeCastro. First question out of his mouth, when are you leaving? I said, were you just at the breakfast I was at? Why are you asking me this question? Literally within that 24-hour period, I get a text from Justin Olson, Justin Stan. Justin heads up our True North staff, and Justin sends me a text, and I checked my text. I had not heard from him via text for 4 months prior. It's not like we text every day. He sends me this picture of us on the tube float the prior summer. It says, the face of Fort Wilderness Promotions. I said, okay, Lord, you have my attention. What is the Lord doing in all of this? And it was later that year, this past year, as you see the picture of Tom passing the baton at the staff meeting, that I came on staff as the director of Fort Wilderness. So what's the conclusion to all this from the Fort story? Is this what Norm talked about in Deuteronomy? God led us. He humbled us. I've always thought that death is the greatest humility that there is. That will humble us like no other. He tested us. We're going to test, and if it didn't work out with Peyton, we're out. We're no longer in this game, God, because we didn't get what we wanted. He taught us to live by bread alone or to rely on our own capabilities. But ultimately, as Norm concluded, it's to accomplish His good purposes. Now, I don't want anybody to walk away tonight thinking that I would trade Peyton, or in the game Red Rover, we'd step across that line, we would volunteer, and I'm sure Norm would be the same way. You don't want to go through this stuff. But if the Lord reveals, and clearly He has in all these providential things, what are we supposed to do? We were just asked to see Him at work and take steps to follow Him to serve Jesus. That's all we're trying to do. And if it has to be Fort Wilderness, I can think of a lot worse things to do than coming to Fort Wilderness. Thank you. I'm going to share now about the work of Fort Wilderness. I want to thank you for indulging Robyn and I in sharing that story, because many of you are family literally. We've lived life together for 20 years. You can see how you've been a part of the story. And we are really excited to be here, and I'm excited to be here. So it was clear to the elders, our small group, family, and friends, that we were called to Fort Wilderness. And I remember having the discussions. Mark Hartman can stand up because Mark was an elder, and Eric Bobbitt was an elder at Zionsville Fellowship. Mark and Eric was already up. So it was compelling that we were supposed to be here. But what I didn't know is, why are we here? What is it that you have for us in this season, as Craig said? And so I want to share with you in a few minutes a couple of things that are really important to me as we start this journey together, because as Craig said, it is the Fort family. First is to continue the legacy. We've talked about that. As I've shared with Tom, I was not the man that the Robertsons were to be able to create this vision and do all the things that they've done for the last 61 years. I mean, the relationships that have been established, the impact for the gospel, it's just been tremendous. But the second thing is, we've got to continue this ministry mindset and emphasis in everything we do. We've got to make sure that the people we hire, the spiritual health and development of our staff, our relationships with the local church, and everything that we do in conducting our programs and camps would have ministry at the forefront. We've got to be culturally engaged. I think, as you're all aware, we live in a challenging culture right now. And we increasingly see that people are living for the just for now. And there's a lot of people that are hurting and seeking. And we've got to build bridges to people that don't understand the truth of Christ and don't live according to God's truth. And we need to come alongside and help people. And we've got to have the desire that everyone should know Him. And that's the challenge for all of us as we leave this place at the end of the week. How do we take the love that Christ has shown us through Fort Wilderness or anywhere and take it to the rest of humanity? And then finally, what I'm really going to focus our time together tonight is we've got to acquire and develop the resources necessary to make this happen. We have a great team of missionary staff people, and I know many of you are very familiar with that as they've been coming for a number of years. These individuals have a deep understanding of the culture and value of Fort, an experience which cannot be replicated in the short term. We have a really great team. But one of the things that I talked about with the board this past summer was the fact that almost half of our staff are at, near, or beyond the traditional age of retirement. So that's almost 10 staff members that are at that stage or season of life. Now, what I did not expect once I got here was the number of transitions beyond the immediate transition of Tom's role that would happen due to health or personal reasons. As you heard earlier this week, our Chief Operating Officer, Craig Rass, who literally ran camp. My first day on the job was a Friday. It was orientation. The second day was a board meeting. And the third day, Craig would no longer come back. He would pass away 2 months later from cancer. Craig was responsible for everything in camp. Everything kind of reported up through Craig. He and his wife, Margaret, were great servants of Fort Wilderness. So this created a significant adjustment. Ron Robertson and Jim Fleming are transitioning and have transitioned to part-time. Jonathan mentioned that Jamie has transitioned to the emergency management group. And so in about 6 months or so, that's about 4 full-time equivalents we got to figure out how to replace, in addition to what might happen with those 10 in the coming years. But here's what I'm really excited about. I'm confident that the Lord will raise up the individuals that he needs to serve in these roles. We have a great management team. Jonathan Brood has taken over the reins, pun intended, of the adult and family ministry team. You heard from Seth Meeks this morning. He's heading up our student ministries and our missionary support process. Craig Holmquist is doing an outstanding job in the role that God has put him in relative to how do we connect and engage with all of these churches in our ministry partnership effort and our communication. Katie Lutz in our outpost has assumed a personnel role, and then Paul and Lisa have also expanded their responsibilities. So we have a great team. We've also got some great short-term staff like Charlotte and Molly who are doing some great things and who may be the future missionary staff members coming down the road. And then one of your own, Steve and Jill Leahy, applause. Are coming on board. The goal is at the end of this year to lead up our construction program. And again, how exciting, because as Paul Zolkowski would say, we've had 12 years where we've not had a construction person, an operations lead person, and the ability just to manage this massive amount of facilities, build the necessary infrastructure, and with Steve's background experience, it's going to just add a lot to our efforts. And most importantly, of how we engage with all the volunteers that want to come alongside us. So we're excited that you guys are joining us. I'm an accountant by background, and I told Bill Byram that I'd be brief in this regard because he and I are the only ones that would care about this. But we have a board meeting Saturday, and Tom knows this because he likes to kid me about it as well. But we place a high value on financial stewardship. We have no debt. We fully fund projects before we build them, and we're blessed by thousands of hours of free labor. So thank you for anybody that's contributed free labor to camp. We're going to freeze prices for family and youth camps for the coming year, and we want to look at rebalancing our pricing in the future to make it more affordable for families to come to camp. So in that regard, invite people to come to camp. That's the best way we can keep prices down. But as this graph shows, about 47% of our fees come from programs or services. Almost half come from donations from folks like you, 49%. And of that 49%, 21% comes in the missionary staff, like the Leahys. They will raise their own support. And this year, that's about $900,000. So here's the challenge for those that like business models like I do. Sorry about that. And the Leahys can attest to this. Usually it takes about a year or more from once you inquire to coming on staff. So as I recall, Steve, you had the conversation, I think, on or around January 16th with Craig Holmquist. Hey, I see some steering And that started a pretty aggressive process. And Steve comes from a church that's very familiar with Fort. It's got elders and a church body behind it. It's got a former board member that's a marketing machine behind it. But it's going to take a year. Well, you can imagine if we've got 10 to 15 spots to fill and it's a year to bring people on board, that's a long time. So we have that challenge. I'm trusting in the Lord. Believe it or not, last week we actually had 2 campers at family camp that had quasi-interviews while they were here for family camp to come on missionary staff last week. One of which we had an idea might happen. The other just said, I'm convicted. And so who knows what's going to happen and how the Lord might meet our needs through that. But here's the issue. When we bring people on staff, and we've got a couple, June Connolly, our staffing coordinator, is going to go to part-time here at the end of the summer. So what do? We've got a couple of people who've interviewed. They're great, but they won't have raised missionary staff support. So we may need to pay them in the short term. So what we want to do is we want to raise some funds to provide for things like staff salaries while they're raising their support, or helping the Leahys move here. Because, candidly, you go from a private sector job to a missionary job, it's a little bit different. How do we help support them by providing funds so they can get here and get started? Training or professional development. Transitional housing. Go look at the Hogan. It's borderline acceptable, but it could be upgraded. The Leahys, you're planning to, I think, go there. Is that true still? Did you visit it yet? Okay. Well, Steve came to me this week. He said, can we go look at the Hogan? I said, well, I knew you might ask, so I looked at it for the first time, so. And there's other contingency funds for unknown cost. So as Craig said, here's what the board and I talked about as we headed into the summer and where we're going to ask for your help. We established a goal to raise $300,000 this summer to help to provide for some of the funding that we just talked about. And so by math, could be $20,000 to $25,000 a person for those 10 to 15 people over the coming 5 years. And thus far this summer, we've raised about $110,000. Had a half dozen people contribute $10,000. We've had a dozen people contribute $100 or less, and everything in between. We just want you to prayerfully consider, to the extent that Fort Wilderness has had a significant impact in your lives, or with your children or your grandchildren, or more importantly, God's children, is this something that you could come alongside us and help to support the next generation of staff, as Craig said? So what I'd ask you is you and your spouse, as appropriate, to consider a gift to invest in that future. And consider making a gift based on the level of importance that Fort Wilderness is to you and your family. As you probably found out, there are cards sitting next to you. I prefer to think of this differently than Dave Herbon last night about, what'd you call it, the shakedown? I thought this was a very compelling, thoughtful, heartfelt message, Dave, and you have diminished it to a shakedown. I hope the Lord calls you to ministry through Fort Wilderness. That was not in my script, but the Lord told me to say that. So you can make gifts tonight. We're taking pledges for the coming year. So we'll give you some time now to consider it. Tom, Craig, or I would be glad to respond to any questions that you might have afterwards. But I just want to personally say thank you, because Fort Wilderness means a lot to us. And all the families that are here mean a lot to us, but this is a special week with our family, Zionsville Fellowship, being here. And you guys are the ones that sent us. We wanted to respond to that call. This was not on my strategic agenda, but we are so glad that we're here and that we can impact the lives for the next generation. So thank you.